Amen. Okay, so we started the Mishnah on Nun Vav. Let's see, where are we? On Nun Vav Amid Aleph on the bottom. We started the Mishnah, and that Mishnah said we've been learning about all the things that where Ono applies, and this Mishnah talks about where Ono does not apply. And very quickly, the Mishnah said it doesn't apply to avodim, shtoros, karkos, and hegdish. And those four categories have something in common because they're not metaltalin. They're not movable objects. In other words, metaltalin is really the catalyst for oinoah. And these, for various reasons that we discussed and will continue to discuss, are not considered metaltalin. On the face of it, it's pretty clear. An eved, a shtar, we explained a little bit more detail because it's not the shtar that is the issue. If the paper was used like wrapping paper, that's a metaltalin. But the shtar itself, what it represents is a debt, and that so therefore it's not considered oinoah because the paper is not. It's the debt that is important, not the paper. So the paper therefore is a throwaway. But if you use the paper for something, then that is considered metaltalin. And then we said karka and hegdish. Okay, so those are the four categories. The Mishnah went on. We won't go into that because the Gemara will revisit it when we learn the Gemara. But so basically, the question is, what is Gemara asked? What was the source of these halachas? That in other words, that Ono doesn't apply. And the Gemara said because it says in the pasuk, "V'chisimkru mimka lamisecha okona miyad amisecha." So from that pasuk, using the term yad, using the term hand, what can a hand accomplish? What can a hand do? It can handle metaltalin, movable objects. There's no yad for karka. There's no yad for an eved. So in other words, anything that's out of the realm of yad, which we define as the movable object, there is no ono. So that was the principle for which we're going to start today. We're on Nun Vav Amid Beis, and we're starting with Maskifle Rabba Bar Mamol. I guess it's about maybe 20 lines from the top or so in the middle of the page. Maskifle Rabba Bar Mamol. So the Gemara is now going to go through an interesting discussion about why yad is the catalyst, and is it really correct that yad should be the catalyst? And we're going to see the Gemara go back and forth and try to support and then take it down, support and take it down. Okay, so let's take a look at this. Maskefla Rabbi Mamol kol heicha diksiv yodo. He's asking a kasha. Is it in fact the case that wherever it says yad, the yodo mamishu, it means hand, because we're saying it means hand. We're not saying it's an allegory or for something else. We're saying that yad means yad. Frek, the Ramas says, Rabbi Ramabel, are you really telling me that yad means yad? And he brings a pasuk. Elamiyata diksiv vayikach es kol artzu miyado. The pasuk talks about Sichon, who in Bamidbar, who captured land from Melech of Moab. What do you mean he captured? Did he? It says the Yerter Vayikach he took his kol artzu miyado. What do you mean from his hand? He took the land from the hand of the king of Moab. That doesn't hang together. So you see, the point is, you see, the term yad isn't yad mamish. It can't mean always hand, because the term hand is used in a broader context by the conquering of the land, and that wasn't by hand. So the Gemara wants to then say, what's the whole underpinning of why we say that there is no oinoah by karka or by avodah or by all of these? Because of yad, he just shows you that yad isn't a reliable indicator that of whether or not it really means yad. So he asks a fundamental question: what's pshat here? Yad mamish? It can't be from the pasuk. And the Gemara does this because we look at a hekesh, we look from different sources, and we see the same word is written in a context that doesn't meet our criterion because it's not Yad Metaltalin, certainly not the land that Sichon conquered. So therefore, the Gemara says, "Hachinami d'chol Arabi Yodei havenakadla." So he asks in a lesson of Akasha, does that mean that Sichon put the entire land of the king of Moav in his hand? It's kind of like a sarcastic question. Is that what you're telling me? Yado Mamish, that he took the entire expanse of land from Melech Moav and put it in his hand? Ella Mirshuso. So we have to say that Yad doesn't mean Yad Mamish, it means Mirshuso, from his Rishus. Hachinami Mirshuso. So here too, when we talk about Oina, then hand shouldn't mean hand mamish. It should mean Bershuso. Then ultimately the kasha is, why is land not included in Oina? It's no longer Yad Mamish, which is the reason why land can't be included. Once you see that land doesn't mean Yad Mamish, then you can say Karka should be Oina. You deal with Karka, you have a no issue. So that's the Gemara's kasha. That's a maskef law. That's what the Gemara is asking, is to try to slug up the principle that Yad is the ultimate indicator of a no. Right? So now here we have a kasha. So the Gemara goes on.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
I'm having trouble finding the place.
Okay. Maskif is, let's see, I'll count it 3, 4, 5, 10, 11, 12.
If your Gemara has a notation Bamidbar Chaf Aleph on the edge for a pasuk, that's the pasuk they just quoted, and Maskif is a couple lines above that.
Yeah, it's about roughly 18, 20 lines, Jay, from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16 lines from the top. In the middle of the 16 lines from the top, Maskif Le Rabbi Bar Mumel, the middle of the.
Oh, I got it now.
Yeah.
I was looking sort of halfway down the page.
No, not that far. Not that far. So just
we're a short interlude here. Rabbi, could you tilt your screen a little bit? We're like seeing your nose up. There you go. That's better.
Better?
Yeah.
I have something on my screen that blocks my face, so I can't see. For some reason, I can't see. It says the meeting is in process, but it's blocking my face. Okay, but now it's good. All right. So again, the kasha is, we're relying on the term yad to support why there's no price fraud by karka, and the Gemara brings an example of where the term yad doesn't mean yad; it means possession. It doesn't mean yad. So if it doesn't mean yad, that throws out the whole principle, the whole reason why karka can't be included. So now we see yad doesn't mean yad mamish. Why is there not oino by karka? And by definition, the kasha is on all the other things also. But we're dealing with that with karka right now, and so that's the kasha. How do we deal with that? So the Gemara is going to have to try to repair that in a way that will not allow this kind of issue to creep in. So what does the Gemara say? Says the Gemara, now in reverse, wherever it says yado, lav yado mamishu. In other words, he's asking the kasha in reverse, in wonderment. You mean to tell me that whenever it says yad, it doesn't mean a hand mamish for Hatanya? So in other words, he's going to go in the opposite direction. We learned in a brisa, what does the brisa tell us? Timotze biyado. Okay, this is about a ganef, that it says, look at the double language. Im himotze timotze biyado, if the theft is found in his hand, double language. So we know always when we ask this consistently, is when the Torah uses something that seems out of the ordinary, it must mean something significant. It could have just said, if the Geneva is found in his hand, that makes sense. Then he has to pay kefil. Okay, fine. The Torah is telling us something more. What is the Torah telling us? Ainli ela. It doesn't mean only his hand, meaning he stole it and you find it in his hand. Gago chatzero v'kafifo menayin. How do we know that if we find the theft on his roof, in his courtyard, or his carfifo is kind of like a large area that is enclosed that belongs to him, maybe a pasture or something. How do we know that if we find the Geneva there that he's chayiv kefil? Because it says yado. We didn't find it in his hand. We found it in his possession. That should exempt him from kefil. But nevertheless, the Torah says, Talmud Lomer, himotze to motze mikol makom, that himotze, the extra word timotze, tells us that the Geneva of Chiyuv is not just in his hand, but it's also in his possession. So now we see that the term yad actually means yad. But the only reason why it says, in other words, the only reason why we say that a Geneva found on the roof or in the chutzner is considered kefel because he motze to motze. If not for that extra word, the Geneva would only be in his hand. So we see that hand means hand mamish. The Gemara is trying to counter what we said about sichon, where yad doesn't mean yad mamish. Says the Gemara, of course it means mamish, because you see the only reason why you're chayiv kefel when you're a ganif in your possession is because of the extra timotze. But if not for that timotze, then yad would mean literally yad. So the Gemara is then now trying to say, and we're going to see that what the story is with Sichon in a minute. But the Gemara is trying to prove from the Brisa that yad has to mean mamish yad. Otherwise, why he must say tamotze for possession? Why isn't it yad? Because yad can't include possession. It's the timotze, the extra word, that includes possession. So that's the Gemara's answer to the kasha, and says no, it's no raya, because we see from the Brisa. Okay, so let's go. So now the Gemara is going to explain. Tama diksiv rachmana imimotze timotze. The reason why he's chayiv b'kefel in the case where you find it's other than in his hand is because he motze timotze, right? Holav hachi. But if not for the extra word hava amina, I would have said kol hechad diksiv yada mamishu. So, okay, so the Gemara is now explaining what we just said, is that yad means yad mamish. It takes the timotze to tell us that there is kefel in the possession. So this is the way the Gemara wants to counter and slug up what the kasha of Rabbi Bar Mamel, and saying, no, you're not right, that yodo does mean yodo mamish, and we'll look at Sichon in a minute, and the raya is from the Brisa, because the Torah Beferish tells us that we need the timotze in order to include possession. Otherwise, yad would literally mean yad, right? Okay, so that's the teretz to the kasha. And now the Gemara wants to bring another raya, visu tanya, and we learned also in the Brisa, v'nosan b'yada. Remember, by get, what do we say by get? That if a man sends a shaliach to give a get to his wife, he has to put it in her hand. But we also know that if he throws it at her in the Dalet Amos, that it's considered a get. So now you have that same issue. Okay, Ainli Eliyada. It says v'nosan b'yada, you have to literally put it in her hand, right? But into the wife's hand. Gaga chatzer v'karfifa minayin. How do we know if you throw it into her private? Like a chutzner is hers or yigag is hers? How do we know if we put it into her possession, it's also okay? Talmud Lomer v'nosan mikol makom, because the Torah says v'nosan, not just biyada, that from the term v'nosan he wants to learn that wherever he gave it, just like timotze in the case of ganif, the word v'nosan by get is what tells us that the nesina, the giving, can be more than in just the hand. So that's the second raya that the Gemara wants to bring, that yodo means yodo mamish, and it's only because of v'nosan that we go weiter. Now, lahavdil, today, when you want to do service, you serve a process, let's say you want to initiate a litigation, you have to give it, or you don't have to literally hand it to him. If you want to sue somebody, you don't have to hand it to him. You put it at his feet, or you put it in his possession, and that's considered service. Where does that come from? It comes from the Gemara, because the Gemara says that giving doesn't mean giving literally in the hand. It means giving in a wider. Now, of course, the Torah doesn't talk about service and process, but the whole principle of it comes from here, that Nesina does not have to be in the hand literally. So we have two rayas, one from a ganef and one from a get, that the Torah is telling us that there are reasons why putting it in the possession of a person is like his hand, but without that extra word, we wouldn't know it. From the word yad, I know yad mamish. It's the extra word. Motze timotze, v'nosam biyada. Those extra words are what is giving us the clarity that it doesn't have to be literally in his hand, but it could be okay. So now the Gemara explains, just as it explained before, Tama diksiv rachmana v'nosa. The reason why you can throw it in her possession is because the Torah says v'nosa b'yada. Olav hachi, but if not for that, ava amina hel diksiv yada yada mamish. But if not for nosan, I would say hand means hand mamish. Right. So again, as we said, that's the reason why yad means yad mamish, and it takes another word in the Torah to infer that you can go beyond just the yad. Okay, and that's the halacha, by the way, that yad doesn't mean yad mamish. I mean, yad means yad mamish, but in the cases where the Torah allows a latitude that you don't have to use just the yad, then you can use the possessions as well, as long as it's within either Dalet Amos or what's considered her possession. Now, if that was joint possession, if they had a joint house, and he put it in the possession, then there would be a problem with giving, because that's not her possession. It has to be miyuchad to her. It has to be something that she alone. So presumably, when the Torah means this, it says he's giving it to her in her own possession, not a joint possession that she has with the husband, because then it would put a cloud on the question of whether or not there was proper receipt. Maybe there wasn't proper receipt if the property is not exclusively her. Now, if you always put it in her hand, there's no question there's proper receipt. But if you put it in a property that she doesn't solely own, that poses a problem. Now, of course, by Ghana, if it's one issue, but by get, it's a more serious issue, as we always say, because by gittin, you're talking about isurin. You're talking about what, she may marry, she may have a child. I mean, all these other issues that could come from that, which pose a problem. It's not as much a problem by Ghana. Of course, you have to pay careful, but you can argue that. But by isurim, we have a much bigger problem. So the Torah makes it clear that if it's her possession, it's okay. So then now the Gemara says, Elakol yodo yodo mamish. So the Gemara says emphatically, yad means yad mamish, and therefore karka has no ono, right? Now let's go back to Sichon. What does the Torah tell us? V'shani hocha, by hosam rather, the lekela meimer hochi. But in a case that is so obvious that it can't mean yad mamish, this is an interesting distinction. The Gemara says elo b'shuso. In other words, you're right. Yad means yad mamish 100%. But where it uses the term yad, and without equivocation, the term yad can't mean hand, because Sichon didn't hold the land of Moab in his hand. So we see it with our eyes that yad doesn't mean yad. So the Gemara wants to tell us that's an exception where yad can be interpreted in a broader sense. So really the Gemara is saying that in all cases, in the normal sense, yad means yad, and therefore karka is excluded. But where yad is used in such a way, like by Sichon, where clearly everybody understands that he could not hold the entire land in his hand, it's unambiguous that yad means more than just the yad. It means possession. But where it isn't obvious, where it isn't so clear, as in the cases that we've just cited, you can't say, oh, it means more than just hand. There we need the extra words in the Torah to give us that insight that there's more than just the hand that is at play here, like in a ganef or in a get. All right, so let's take a look. Look at Rashi. Okay, where are you? Okay, so the Rashi says Yodo Mamishu. Uh, Dakdaikto le'el miyad amisecho metaltalim dafka hanikden miyad el yad. All right, so that's the principle that tells us that we're only dealing with yad liyad, so we have to deal with metaltalin, and therefore karka is excluded. Hochi nami mershus amisecho komer v'afil kakos nami b'mashma. Ein li shichayv kefel ela bezman shalokcha biyado. So there's only kefel. This is the Gemara goes through it and says when you take it from his hand. Gabe chatzera karfifa menayin. So how do you know that there's kefel when a person stole and it's found not on his hand but in his possession? Shem nichtas hasham v'nol b'fanea the geneva menayin sheniktas alo chatzero u'mechayiv kefel. Maybe he's not chayiv kefel as long as he's not holding it in his hand. So a wise ganef is not going to keep it in his hand, and he'll put it in his garage. And you find it, okay, fine, you found it, but there's no kefel. So how do you know that there's kefel? Talmud loma v'nosan. Okay, so that's timsa. But by get v'nosan mikol makam with lo ksiv b'yada. Yitnanu, since it doesn't say that he has to give it in her hand. Therefore, we learn from Venosan that Venosan, just like we learn by the words Himotze Timotze, we also learn by Venosan. Okay, so we explained that. Shani Hossam Vayikach is called Arzo, that he took entire land. It's clear that it can't mean in his hand. So that's the Gemara's conclusion. So they tried to slug up and say, why is karka not included because of yado? And the teretz is, it always means yado mamish. There's exclusions in the case of get, there's exclusion in the case of geneva. There may be other cases where there's exclusion. And the sichon analogy isn't apt because there it's so clear that the Torah was using the term yad in a different context, so you can't argue it means yad mamish. All right, so we see that there is there's a rule and then there's an exception to the rule. The rule is yad means yad mamish. And the exception is in such a case, and again, he doesn't bring down other examples, but maybe we'll find another example where yad is clearly not yad itself, but it means more than yad. But the case of sichon, he brings down because the Torah uses the word yad. Maybe it doesn't use yad in other contexts when it comes to possession. So, all right, that's the Gemara so far. Okay, so now the Gemara goes on. And the Gemara is going to go a little further and probe this whole issue, because now we need to understand further in the more depth what the whole inyan is of ono and why it can or cannot apply in a particular case. So now Shrek the Gemara, boy, Rab Zera asked the following kasha: Schiras yesh lo ono and lo ono. So very good question. If you sell something and you commit a price fraud, clear on its face, it's price fraud. It's price fraud. But what happens if you rent something? I'm going to rent a lawnmower from you, and then the pricing will be outrageous, and there'll be no. Does it apply? Maybe it doesn't apply by schirus. Maybe it only applies by a sale. That's the Gemara's kasha. Schirus yesh lo no ein lo no. Does I know apply to schirus when you rent something and you don't purchase it? Is there a distinction? Okay, so what's the kasha? So that what's nice about the next Gemaras is the Gemara is going to take apart the question and explain in detail why it should or shouldn't be. Okay, and that is that's the whole inyan here is we're trying to understand why it should or shouldn't be. So it says mimka amar rachmana. By yono it says the word mimkar. Right? What is mimkar? Mimkar is a sale. So the chayra we see avaloi schirus. So when it says a sale means a sale. It doesn't mean schirus. O dilma loshna. Or perhaps we're going to say that there is no difference between a sale and a rental. So why? In other words, why should a when it says mimkar, should it include a sale? That's the kasha. Should it include a sale or not? That's the ultimate kasha. Omale Abaya. So Abaya answered Reb Zera, Mi ksiv, listen to the distinction. Mi ksiv mimkar la'olam. Does the Torah tell us that when price fraud applies by a sale, it means la'olam, meaning a sale, final sale? Mimkar stomach siv. It says the term mimkar, simply mimkar. Hainami biyoma mimkari mechirahu. This is a sale for a day. So if you really take it apart, what is rental? Rental is a sale for one day. And one day you give it back. That's also mimkar. So if you parse the words mimkar, then you could say a schira is a mimkar. It's not a permanent sale, it's a temporary sale, and the Torah doesn't make a distinction between a permanent sale and a temporary sale when it comes to Ainah. So that's the teretz.
But Rabbi,
Yeah.
But a rental is not ownership. It
Correct.
is use, and it implies a different level of commitment than an actual sale because of transference of ownership. As a rental, you have to respect the responsibilities of the person who's renting. So you're using something, but it's not a sale. So
But
I don't see how it can be compared as such.
Okay, so that's a good question, because by definition, they're distinction. So what the Gemara is trying to tell us, that since you have responsibilities of ownership while you rent it, right? Because if you're shoy mechinam, then you're chayiv b'geneva aveda, you're chayiv by a pshia and all these other things. So those categories that would imply that you own it are foisted upon you when you rent. So then, if you're using it and someone sees you're using it, they don't. In other words, something belongs to you, Michael, and you rent it to me, and I have it, and Menashe comes by and he sees I'm using it. Oh, Michael must have sold it to Tuvia, because after all, it's Michael's. Why, so he must assume that I control it, I have it. Well, the term own is a little bit loose, but so on the face of it, one can argue, yes, that I do own it. I have to give it back in 24 hours, but I do own it because I have responsibilities of ownership. That's, I think, what the Gemara is trying to show us, is that since it doesn't say oino has to be a permanent sale, then something that looks like a temporary sale, notwithstanding your kasha, I understand, but something that looks like a temporary sale should also be included in ono.
But its appearance. The difference is that if you really own it, you can take liberties that you cannot take as a renter, because you have to protect the property of the true owner. So that's why the word sale is not connote rental. I mean, they are different mamish.
No, there's no question. There's no question that your kasha is on point. Is that there are distinctions ultimately between a sale and a rental, but I think what the Gemara is trying to show us here is that according to Abaya, the Torah itself says that it has to be a sale in order for oinah to apply, and the way the Gemara is interpreting a lease, it's saying that a lease is ironclad like a sale for the period of time. I understand the kasha. But I think what the Gemara is trying to say, and why they're including a rental into the category of oinah, is because you totally control it. It may not be yours in the sense that we understand purchase is yours, but you control it to the exclusion of everybody else. And that's the definition of a sale. I'm talking just, of course there's a difference. But in terms of definition, when you rent something, you're in total control of that. If I rent it to you, I can't come back to you, and it's for 24 hours. I can't come back to you in 10 hours and say, give it back to me. It's not mine. It's yours for 24 hours. That's where the Gemara, I think, is trying to make the comparison that a rental, for a temporary rental, has the strength of a mechira during the time. Yes, there are
But
differences.
there are conditions on that rental that the owner
Correct.
can seize it if you violate those conditions. So it's not a true sale because you don't have true freedom of ownership.
Okay, so here's the difference, I think. You're right that there are conditions, but within the framework of the time of the rental, it's absolute. In other words, yes, there's conditions on a rental that don't apply on a sale, but during the period of time that I'm renting it, no matter what I do to it, and you see it, you can't say a word. I could take it apart. You rent me a lawnmower. You come by my property and the entire lawnmower is taken apart, laying on my field. You can't come in and say, "What did you do to my lawnmower?" During that 24-hour period that you rented it, it's completely yours. You can do what you want with it. There may be repercussions if you're careless or do something that later it can't be repaired. Fine, but during the period of the rental, it's ironclad like a sale. I think that's the chilek. I understand the concern, but
I would just
when we look at the
amplify.
thread, it's the permanence during that 24 hours. Yeah, Jay.
But I'm agreeing here with Michael. He always
Yeah.
asked a great
I
question,
understand.
but I wish I would ask first. But it when you rent, I mean, the star for renting is totally different than the star for a sale. So, for example, the question of warranty, is there a warranty implied in a rental or is it not? When you sell something to somebody, it's as is, no warranty and all of that. So the side effect of something not working properly or breaking down is totally two different conditions here. Why would you want to lump them together and say it's equivalent? It's not. It's nowhere near equivalent.
Again, what when
Michael, am I
you
right?
yeah. So again, I can't argue with the fact that the conditions of a sale and the conditions of a rental are different. And if you had a star, they would be different. But what the Gemara is telling us, I think, is what I was trying to say before, is that notwithstanding the trappings, the star, the permanence, the temporary nature of it, during the period of a rental, you have an ironclad ownership like a sale. Now you may say
Can't sell it.
you don't really because you're still renting it. But again, I'm trying to separate the principle of it, of course, is that on a permanent level you don't own it. But the Gemara is trying to tell us you don't need permanence, that you don't need to own it after the 24 hours in order to be considered yours. It's absolutely yours during the period of the rental, come, as we say in the expression, hell or high water. It doesn't matter. It's yours.
Can't sell it.
Every condition of ownership has been met during the 24 hours, and you,
No.
as the original owner, have no rights to it whatsoever. That's how far rental goes, says the
But
Gemara. Yeah.
Rabbi, excuse me, Rabbi, it isn't the same because you're not allowed to sell it during the rental period. So
You're not allowed to what? You're not allowed to what?
But you could
you're not
sublet
allowed
it.
to sell something you rent.
But you could sublet it.
Not
You
if
could rent
it's
it for 20
restricted.
for 48 hours and
Not if it's
unless
restricted.
Yeah, no, but Menashe is right. If there's no bar,
if
then you can sublet it.
Stam rental, I rented for 2 days,
And I
and
sublet it for a day.
for one of those days I rented off to somebody else.
But you can't sell it
I can't
away.
sell it. Yeah.
No, okay, you can't sell it, but
You don't own it as far as the fact
you don't own it the way
owner-
you own. No, you're right. You don't own it the way you own an outright sale. But what Abaye is saying is the term mechira doesn't mean la'olam. That's exactly the point. It doesn't mean la'olam. He's trying to parse the word mimkar, and he says mimkar, which it says just the word mimkar alone means a sale. Now, as long as what are the criterion of a sale? The definition of a sale is that I own it to the, it doesn't say permanent. This is the point. A sale is I own it to the exclusion of everybody else. That is the definition of a sale.
Rabbi, the real difference, and you said this before, it's a control issue. I can control it for that period. That is not the same as a sale, and the Gemara is trying to make the control, even for a day, the same as the conditions for a permanent sale, and saying that control is de facto a sale. And that I have major problems with, but
I hear it.
that's the only thing you can say is that you control it in both cases.
That's correct. And that's, I think, the ultimate point. You're correct, is that you control it, and whether it's temporary control or permanent control, the word control is the operative word. And like Menashe said, you can do anything you want with it. You can not sell it, but you can rent it to somebody else, unless there's an exclusion in the shtar, which sometimes there is with limitations. But let's say there's no limitation. It's yours for 24 hours to 48 hours. Do what you want with it, and you're going to make money on it because you're going to rent it to somebody else, and the original owner can't do anything about it because he can't touch it during that 24, 48-hour period. So we see that mechira, the term mechira, is not a hard and fast mechira the way we understand. I sell you something, you go your way, I go my way. Rather, it is a mechira for whatever period you are making the mechira. A day, a week, a month, forever, doesn't matter. Mechira has a different definition. Yeah.
But Rabbi, the only thing I'll say is we learned Ona, the principle of Ona, on a number of other things before when it truly was sale. It was
correct, a sale.
So we're now introducing a new concept of control here.
Correct.
That is different from sale that we talked about so many.
Sale the way we understand it. Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
So where I have a problem is I'm fine if for this purpose it's control, not sale. But to then have to go back and say everything we talked about before was the same, would be the same conditions as if we rented it versus sold it, I really have a problem with it.
But when we defined the sale in Ono, we strictly spoke about I'm selling you something in the normal context of the word mechira. We understood it to mean, yeah, I'm selling you something. I no longer have any rights.
Because the price of a rental could be for a day much higher than the sale of an item forever. So all the principles, the 1/5, the 1/6, all that stuff goes out the window because you don't necessarily have a market delineation, because I'm sure in those days it wasn't that common always to rent as opposed to sell.
But no, a lot of people couldn't afford. Let's say a person can't afford to buy something, but he needs it. So I'll make a deal with you. I'll own it only for a period of time, and then I'll give it back to you. And so again, that's the conclusion of Abaya, that schira is mechira, however temporary. It's mechira. I understand all the issues. The questions are good questions, but I think what Abaya is trying to tell us is that schira, for purposes of the period of time that you own it, is as ironclad as mechira, and therefore, since Ono applies by mechira, it also applies by schira. I mean, again, there is a distinction. Of course, there's a distinction, but I think go ahead, John.
Tuvia, I think I remember a discussion whereby what's the responsibility of the renter or the owner in case of damage or the item being stolen.
Depends whether you're shomachinam or shomasacha, right?
That there's a difference between ownership and rental. Yeah. Also in lending, if he lends a person the item, what his responsibility as a borrower is different than responsibility as a renter would be.
Correct. There's the four categories. There's socher and a shoel, right? A socher is a renter, a shoel is a borrower. You're right.
And then, okay. So, I mean, is that where it's the type of use that we're talking about? What is
Of the four categories, Shomachinim, Chamishacha, Socher, and Shoel, we're focused on a Socher. A Socher is a renter, and a renter has the ultimate responsibility. Of the four categories, a Socher, a renter, has a more onerous responsibility than either a Shomer Chinam or Socher or a borrower. In other words, it's all different. But we're focused in on the Socher who is paying money to use an item exclusively for a period of time. And the Gemara questioned whether or not if someone rented him for an exorbitant price, which violated the Ono principles, is it Ono? After all,
what's the Ono principle again?
The Ono principle is that you cannot sell something to someone which for more than a 1/6 of what its normal value. If in other words, if the price for an item that I'm selling you is $100, you can't come back and sell it to me for $150. That's price fraud. That's price fraud. It has to be within 1/6 of what is considered the normal price. So we have to evaluate what the normal price is, and therefore we say, like Michael said, 1/5, 1/6. But let's, depending on how you look at it, but let's say it's 1/6. So I can't make a profit more than 1/6 according to the halacha. I can't. Now, there's unusual circumstances when maybe it's a rare item that doesn't have a market. We're not going to go into that. We're going to just say that if the normal item is sold for $99.99, you can't sell it for $150.99 because you're considering price for it. But what happens if I rent it to you for a price which would be considered exorbitant even for a rental? So for a rental, maybe I should charge you $39.99, and instead I'm charging you $79.99. Wait a minute, maybe that's not price fraud because it's not yours, it's really mine. The teretz is, says Abaya, when you rent it, it has the definition of ownership the same as a sale. Now I understand Michael and Jay, everybody has it's a legitimate, you can parse that, but for purposes of what we have to understand, says Abaya, the Gemara, the Torah never told us mechira and defined mechira with the word permanent. So once there is no permanence in mechira, Torah should have said, Meichel Olam. If someone sells something with absolute no return policy, it's yours forever, and you sell it for higher than what would be no, then you're chayv on no. But the Torah never went to that detail. Torah said a mimkar. And again, the Gemara, Abaya is telling us that mimkar in its common term means a sale, but it doesn't mean a sale forever. It can even mean a temporary sale for 24 hours, 48, a week, a month, doesn't matter. And once you have what we call rental, quote, a sale for temporary purposes, according to Abaya, that is considered enough. Again, we can go around and around with this, and I understand the concern, but I really wanted to get to the next Gemara.
I have to bring up one sort of point in the other direction, which is because in general, I would say no, a rental's not the same as a sale, but there's another extreme, the real world recent situation, Hong Kong. I just looked this up. It was leased basically a $0 lease for 99 years. And why do they pick 99 years? Because it says the
laws of perpetuity.
Well, no, but the British representative considered 99 was as good as forever. Now, China ended up
that's right. And
China ended up wanting it back and took it back, forced to basically ended up having to give it back, and we're living with the repercussions of that. But the point is, during that 99 years, people lived on it, worked, built things, and everything else truly as if
they owned it out. Yes,
they owned it outright.
Yeah, good example. Good example. So we see that even temporary has a permanence to it that, and again, Michael, it's a good point. It really is a good point. But conclusively, Abaya is telling us that the term mechira is loosely interpreted, and therefore schira can happen. So if you have a problem with this, let's go to the next one where you're really going to have an issue.
Just one short question. Isn't the whole question of Yovel and returning things in the background for this discussion?
Not in Mechira, Jay. In Schira, not in Mechira. If I sell you something outright, Yovel has no is not an issue. It's if I lend you something and there is not that sense of permanence that we talk about.
The same with rental, something?
Well,
I rent a car for a year.
Right.
And Yeovil comes.
No, yeah, but okay. So
Yeovil applies to land, not to cars.
yeah, it's not to movables. It's to land, because land had a different again, especially in those days. I mean, land was the sustenance. That's how people lived. Today we don't necessarily need land to live. But so the Torah created laws around land that don't necessarily apply to metaltalin or to other things. So you can't really bring Yovel into the picture. But again, this all rises to the question of permanence versus temporary and how we look at it. So let's segue to this next issue, because this is really going to encourage a discussion. Boy Rava asks the kasha, Chitten uzroin bekarka mahu. Just like we asked the kasha by Shtoris, he asked the question, if you take chittens, wheat, the seeds of wheat, you put them into the ground, you're planting them, right? Okay. Yesh lahem oino? Are they considered land, and are they considered metaltalin? Or ein lahem oino? Now we have a question of whether you put seeds into the ground, does it now become karka, no ono, or is it still seeds and there is ono? You hear the question? In other words, it's clearly a metaltalin, but does it change its character from metaltalin to karka because you put it into the ground and now it's part of the ground as opposed to metaltalin? That's an inspiring question. So the Gemara wants to say, what's the kasha? What's really at the essence of the kasha, right? Command the shaiden bikada domyan v'yesh lo is putting the seeds like you put it into a box or a barrel, and it's a metaltalin, and therefore it's subject, the fact that it's in the ground, but it's still considered like it's seeds. So if it's seeds, it's like you put it into, if I put a seed into a barrel and I charge you an outrageous price, there is no. Or Dilma, or maybe batlina al gabe ara. No, when you put it into the ground, it's bottle in the ground. Now, we'll see what bottle means in a minute, but it's bottle into the ground, and the ground doesn't have oino. There's no oino b'karka. So it's a fascinating question. You took a metaltalin, which is clearly in the getter of oino, and you put it into the possession, let's call it loosely, of a karka, which doesn't have oino. What is it? What's the metzias? Okay, so that's the kasha. Says the Gemara, hey chadami. What are we talking about? Okay, what are we talking about? It's considered in the kad. It's considered in the karka. If you say that the person who sold the seeds says as follows. In other words, I'm selling you, let's say, this land, but I sowed it with 6 saw of seeds, right? Shadaboshita. I sowed it with 6 saw of seeds. So when you buy it, and I'm charging you this price, so you have to understand that I'm selling you something that has 6 saw of seeds. Now remember, there's no ono in karka. So this wouldn't be a question of price for it, but we're not talking about the karka. We're talking about his statement that I'm selling you karka with 6 saw of seeds. V'amrei, and then there's Adim, there's witnesses, the lo shadaba ela chamisha. And the Adim come along and said, we saw you seed it. You only seeded it with 5 saw. You didn't put 6 saw of seed. You didn't cover the whole property. You covered 80% of the property, whatever. So now, what's the kasha? The kasha isn't on the land. The kasha is on the metaltalin. That's what this kasha of Rava is do we consider it metaltalin because you didn't because you cheated him on the metaltalin, not on the karka. Since you cheated him on the metaltalin, there should be oino, or do we say no, that it is now part of the land and therefore the land has no ono? That's V'ha'amar Rava. Okay, and the Rava said a principle called davar shebemida v'shemishkel v'shememinyan regarding anything that has to do with measurements, or mishkel is weight, or minyan is counting numbers. In other words, if the transaction involves weighing out something or counting out 10, I give you 10 of this and instead of 9 or whatever, afilu pachas miktei no choizer. So Rava established an interesting principle that when you're in the realm of those kinds of transactions where weight or measure, whatever becomes a factor, ono is out the window. You don't need ono to violate it. Anything, even a fraction off is considered returnable because the Torah is very medactic with a person who is selling with minyan and mishkel, with weights. We know that the Torah goes into great detail about the weights and all of these things. So you don't need ono to make it returnable. Even less than ono is returnable, right? So therefore, if someone sells and gives you less seeds than what you need, then it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if it's karka or not. There should be what the overarching issue is, that the metaltalin, in other words, the metaltalin using the weights and measures was off. So the whole principle of ono doesn't apply. In other words, ono applies when you have something specific that you're selling. Forget about measures or weights. I'm selling you a lawnmower for $100. There's no weights, there's no measures, there's nothing going on. And I overcharged you by more than 1/6. That's ono. But if I have to weigh out a pound of, let's say, nails, and I short you by 3 nails, well, that's nothing. 3 nails. And it turns out that there was a witness that said, I saw the weight. You're supposed to give him 5 pounds of nails. You gave him 4.5 or 4.75 pounds. I saw it. It's ono regardless. So now the question of whether or not you put the seeds into the ground becomes secondary, because we're not dealing with a land versus metaltalin issue. We're dealing with a metaltalin that the Torah says there is ono, notwithstanding whether it's a sixth or not, right? So the point here is, we thought in this particular case that there was a question of whether or not there is ono in land or not, because do you treat seeds like they're in land, or do you treat seeds like they're still seeds, in which case there would be ono. Says the Gemara, what are you talking about? You can't bring the question of land versus metaltalin into this issue, because inherently you're talking about metaltalin. You're not talking about the land, even though it's in the land. You're talking about metaltalin because Rava made this make this statement that anytime you're dealing with mishkel or minyan or midah, forget about ono, even a fraction off is considered ono, and it's returnable. So this is the depth of the understanding. We're trying to get into ono now and understand ono, and we have a Rava's principle that in certain cases ono doesn't mean a sixth; it could mean any number. Therefore, when there's a shaila here of is there ono or not because it's in the land or because it's not in the land, he wants to immediately distinguish that that's not the issue. The issue, in other words, the Gemara shows you that even though we're talking about the question of land versus movable, in Rava's principle, it doesn't matter whether it's land. It's still ono because of the weight measurement issue. That's the chiddush here. In other words, Rava is giving us an edict. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we have to remember this is something you just take for granted, but these people called the Torah Rachmana because apparently their main interest was in seeing that they protect somebody who is subject to abuse.
Right, Rachmanis, right, the Rachmanis.
Benefit of the doubt goes to the person who may be
right, right. No, absolutely. Rachmana. In other words, well, actually, what Brahmana really indicates is that we don't always go b'midas hadin, we go b'midas harachamim. In other words, what we call courts of law, courts of equity, it's more equity than it is the law, because in our system of law, there is room for Rahmanis. There is room for Rahmanis. So it's not just strictly law, even though the Torah is very harsh in telling us, what the laws are. But basically, we try to find ways to mitigate or minimize the harshness of the law and still find someone, a penalty or guilty, but not to the extreme of what the black letter law says. So that it's a good point. So, but we see here, okay, so now this is the kasha. So let's go on about Elo de Omar, because of what Rava just said. So we're not strictly speaking about karka versus metaltalin because of Rava's theory. Elo, now he's going to recast the discussion. Elo de Omar I shodabo kidi iboyalo. You don't use a number. Once you take it out of the realm of number, he said, you know what? I'm selling this field with enough seeds to cover the entire field. He doesn't say 6 saw, 5 saw. You have an acre of land, and he said, I'd put enough seeds that it should cover the whole land without a number, right? And bigloi milsa, and it turns out the lo shadabar kidi boile. It starts to grow, or he sees, wait a minute, you didn't seed it. You seeded only 80%, 90%, whatever it is. Now, you can see from the seeding that he left large patches of land unseeded. So, yesh lahem oino or ein lahem oino. Is there oino? You can't use Rava's theory because there's no minyan. There's no number or mishkal or anything, right? So forget about Rava. Now it's the straight question of whether or not, if you seed land, seeding is metaltalin and land is karka, and you made a statement that I'm going to seed it for the whole land, and you only seeded part of the land, is that considered movable and there's oino, or is it considered karka and there's no ono, right? So that's okay. Then the Gemara says, so what's the kasha? Command the shari bevada demayin veyesh lahem oino. So he explains, okay, so but by putting only 80% of the seeds in, you're basically putting it, it's still metaltalin. It's like he said, like putting it in a box. Odilma betlina agavara. Or maybe once you've already planted it, even though it isn't the right amount, it's already karka and there is no oino. Right? So this is now the question. Before, the question was with a number. Gemara says you can't use that. Numbers have a different category entirely. So Gemara says, okay, we're not going to talk about numbers. We're going to talk about in sort of the abstract term. He seeded the land, or did he not seal the entire land? Now oino applies. When does it apply? If you say the seeds are metaltalin. But once you say the seeds are already in the ground, it's not metaltalin. So if he cheated him by 10%, 20%, whatever, it doesn't matter because eino no bekarka. So that's the kasha, right? So again, an interesting concept, because before we were talking about a whole different issue about selling and renting. Okay, fine. We had some issues there, but you can sort of get your arms around it. Here, it opens up a whole new question as to whether or not when you plant a field, is the planting already as if it's karka, or is it not? What defines when it becomes karka? Is it the immediate putting it into the hole or not? Okay, so the Gemara wants to go. We'll go a little bit further. The Gemara wants to go a little bit further, and says that this kasha of whether or not it is or is not part of the field is really totally even on something else. Nishborn alein or ein nishborn alein. Okay, so the law of oath, of shvua, is an interesting law, and again, we'll talk about it, and then probably have to go over it again. And the Gemara says that with regard to Shvuah, that the Torah tells us that there are 3 Shvuas min Torah. What are the 3 Shvuas in business? Okay, we know that Bava Metzia, right? So if someone, I say that you owe me $100, and you say, David, I only owe you 50. You have to swear on the 50. It's called Bava Metzia. Okay, we got that. The second we said is by Shem Mechinam, Shem Mesachar. If you say no, there was no Geneva, and I say clearly there was Geneva, you swear, and therefore you don't have to pay. That's right. And the third is when if I have a transaction with you and an Eid Echad comes and said, no, the transaction is not the way you say it, not Shtei Eidim, Eid Echad. If one witness comes and we know Al Pi Shnayim Eidim, then you can make a Shvuah, and that Shvuah counters the Eid Echad. You can't make a Shvuah when there's 2 Eidim because that's ironclad. But when there's 1 Eid, then it's okay. So fine. So the kasha here is that when he planted the seeds, and it's not the right amount, is there a shvuah required? So now he wants to introduce the concept of shvuah here, and he's saying, is there a shvuah required or not? Because by movable objects, by metaltalin, there is a shvuah. By karka, there's no shvuah. So when you plant these seeds into the ground, it's not just a question, did you plant the right number of seeds? Can you elicit a shvuah and say, you know what? I planted the right amount of seeds. Even though maybe there's an Eid Echad who comes and says you didn't, I can swear. But there's no shvuah b'karka. So if there's no shvuah b'karka, it doesn't matter. When is there a shvuah? Only by metaltalim. So he wants to say that the kasha here about oino on land is even greater because we have a different issue other than just, is it the right amount of land? In other words, is the price okay? It's about shvuah. It's about whether or not you're allowed to make a shvuah and counter what the Eid is saying. If there's an Eid Echad who comes, remember, not Shtayim Eidim, Eid Echad comes and says, you didn't plant a whole field. You planted 80%. He said, no, I planted the whole thing. And I'll swear to it. Wait a minute. If it's karka, you can't swear. If it's metaltalin, you can swear. So the Gemara is making the kasha even more complicated by telling us that the whole principle it has to do with shvuah. So the Gemara is going to continue on with another example of this, and we'll talk about that next week. But so I'll leave you with that question, is that, so now that's the inherent question here, and this is much more detailed than Mechira, Michael and Jay, to the question of whether or not Schirus is Mechira, which I think went into in detail. Here the question is whether or not you can even give rise to the question of oinah because it's no longer metaltalin. So it's a different issue than what we talked about with Mechira, but it's a fascinating issue as to when does something lose its status of metaltalin and become karka when you put it into the ground. Does the ground automatically absorb everything and therefore it's karka and you can't make a shvuah and there's no oinah, nothing? Or are there limitations to whether something becomes karka and when it loses the status of metaltalin? That's what the Gemara is telling us. So the next case will be amplify this, Mitzvah Shem, next week. But think about that, and what's the right answer? When is that dividing line between metaltalin and karka when you take the metaltalin and put it in the karka? And here the Gemara wants to tell us it's not just a question of eino, it's a question of shvuah, which is even maybe a bigger issue because, making a shvuah, in proper shvuah has serious repercussions, al yidei midei shamayim. So in other words, how do we define it? So that's where the Gemara is going. We're going to leave that there. But again, this is an interesting question as we continue to go through the laws of Ono, is even in Karka, there may be a case when it is Karka or it's not Karka. Right. So I don't know, Michael, if you have any issues with this right now, but at this point, we'll pause. And again, next week we'll pick it up and hopefully come to a conclusion. And then if they have a kasha, we can go through it.
So I'll throw out one other thing that's come to mind throughout this whole thing, which is that a modern day somewhat related issue is when you sell a house, or let's say you rent a house and you do stuff to it. If you, let's say you remodel part of it, or you put in some built-in bookcases or something that are now attached to the house. The question becomes, what stuff automatically is considered part of the house, and what stuff is considered something that's could be separated again?
Good question. And you know that, again, that's an excellent question. In modern times, we have a standard, right? If I rent a house and I put in a bookcase, then in most cases, that bookcase now becomes part of the house. In other words, those rules really become modern day issues. You're absolutely correct. Is what's considered karka and what's considered metaltalin. What is movable, what is removable or not removable. So yeah, it's absolutely part of the whole question. And it's a big question, especially, in the times of the Gemara, when people who own karka, we're more the wealthy class. So how much achrayus do they have to give leeway to the people who have less and say, okay, you can have it back, or we're not as makbid maybe as we would be otherwise. And the whole question of Ono really centers around this question, is whether or not Ono applies in every situation. So that's part and parcel of the question, but it's a good point. In other words, where is the end of metaltalin and the beginning of karka? How loosely or strictly do we define metaltalin and karka?